Hi guys, we're back again and welcome to the Hustle Table, where we talk all things hustle, whether it's hustling your career, getting a side hustle, hustling your money, whatever it is, we've got the table for it. I'm Aysha, I'm a finance coach and entrepreneur, and this...
And I'm Natalie, and I've had 10 years worth in banking and finance. And I'm actually really excited for this episode because it's something that's really close to my heart. So I'm going to share a very personal story, and then we have an amazing guest, Rebecca, who is our expert, who will bring us more hints and tips. So I've had a bit of a crazy journey. So my mum has always suffered from mental health. So in my household, it was always something that I knew of, and we always spoke about it, but I'm very conscious that's not the same for our culture, right? And if I look at myself personally, I have gone through my own mental health journey as well. So I had a CBT, which is cognitive behavioural therapy, at a point where I really struggled and I needed that extra support to just figure out the way I was thinking and to rework around my brain a little bit. But Aysha, I don't know if you have had any experience with your mental health at all.
So I think there was a point, especially like during COVID, where I struggled. And I remember like, you were even the one that said, oh, like, have you thought of CBT? And I remember thinking, I can't go and tell my mum and dad that I want to do therapy. Like, they'll look at me. And that's exactly what happened. I went to them and I said, like, I want to try therapy. They were like, therapy? Actually, to be fair, my mum was like, okay, you know, you could. When I spoke to some of my aunties, they were like, therapy care, why don't you just go and pray? And then it became an argument. You don't pray, you're not religious, blah, 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 blah. When in actual fact, like, I feel like without therapy during COVID, I don't know where I'd be, to be honest.
And it's a big thing because everyone has mental health. Everyone has that aspect of mental health, whether it's good or bad, they have it. But Rebecca, I'm gonna come over to you and ask you a slightly leading question. What is mental health?
It's a really good question because it's such a hard thing to define. It's obviously something that we speak about quite often, but what does that really mean? I think if I were to define it, when we think about mental health, it's our thoughts, so our cognitive functioning, it's our feelings, it's the way that we behave, the motivation, that it covers so many different kind of things, like our psychological well-being, emotional, social, all of it. So we have a body, we have our physical health, but we also have our mind and body mental health as well, and that's also what's important that often a lot of people forget. Like you say, we all have mental health. Something I hear often is, I don't have mental health. I'm like, well, that's like saying I don't have a body, I don't have this, like you do. So yeah, something we all have, like you said.
I read a really interesting fact recently that black adults are the lowest ethnic group to receive treatment. It was around 6% compared to white adults, which is around 13%. Now, I said earlier, I know about mental health because it was spoken about in my household, but I remember being told we don't talk about what goes on in the household outside. So why do you think that is? Why are we not speaking about mental health? Like, is it the stigma around it? But yeah, for me, it mind blows me that we don't talk about it.
There are so many different kind of reasons as to why. Like you said, stigma is one of those. In our own families, in our own homes, in our own communities, in our culture, there's that. As you know, we don't have mental health, we don't speak about these things, we deal with it in the family, or probably not, because if we're not really talking about it, we're not speaking about it in the family either, right? Bring it to church or pray about it is something that we hear quite often, which of course is needed, but that doesn't mean that we don't need therapy. There's also, I guess, services play a big role in that as well. So when you're talking about that statistic, I guess it's who's actually getting through the door in the first place. Often, not a lot. Depending on where people are living, there's like a postcode lottery about what services are available, how good they are. And as well, it's people, once they're finally getting through, because you know, black people have so many hurdles to get through to get into any kind of service, particularly mental health. So when you go to the GP and they're not picking up, so for me, my GP didn't pick up that it was depression. It was, you know, you've got low iron, it's this, it's everything that was physical. And it wasn't until I did my own research that I realized this is depression, this is, you know, low mood. So there's so many different things. And then you get to finally see a therapist when you probably go through the NHS, and then they don't even understand your experience very well. You know, they're not very culturally sensitive, so people drop out. And then we get the label of, well, black people are hard to engage with therapy, they're hard to reach, hard to access. We know where we are, we're not hard to access, we're not hard to reach. We've got our own kind of issues in our community that we need to deal with as well, but there's also a service responsibility to be able to reach out to us and, you know, make services benefit us as well.
Touching on depression, yeah? So I feel like depression's become more, I don't want to say popular, but it's become a term that people use often. Like I remember coaching one of the kids that I coach, and she came up to me and she's like, "Oh, miss, I'm depressed.
Yeah.
Jaquan doesn't like me," or whatever the guy's name was. And I was like, you can't just be throwing the word depressed anyhow. But people do now. Whereas like, I remember when I was younger, I could never tell any, you think I could go and tell any auntie or grandma that I was depressed? They'll just look at me like, I'd probably get told off. So one, my question is, where do you think that even comes from? And how are we changing that? Or how do you think we should be changing that?
Ooh, that's a really good question. In terms of where it comes from, I guess the first thing that came to mind is kind of social media, where we're picking up on these terms, these language, but I think a huge part of it is the lack of education, lack of awareness. Like, as far as I'm concerned, mental health is not taught in schools enough. I don't think I've ever, until I was studying psychology at A-levels, heard the term depression and this is what it was, and mental health and this is what it was. We learn about, biology, how our bodies work and all of this, and how smoking is bad for you, rare. But we actually don't learn about mental health and how to look after it, and it's not until you get to the lowest point that a lot of people actually learn about it. So these terms like depression, things like that, it's actually hard to define. I didn't even realise really what it was until I was studying about it. What people are really talking about is that feeling of low, like low mood. We all feel low, we all feel anxious, but depression is actually like a collection of symptoms. Low mood is just one of them. So when we're talking about depression, we're talking about so many different things like under-eating, overeating, poor sleeping, oversleeping, loss of motivation, suicidal ideation, all of those kind of different things. And it's not just young people as well. It's so many that use the term depressed, I feel so depressed. It's like, of course that then takes away from the sentiment of what depression actually is, but maybe they just don't know what depression is. They just see it as, oh, I feel low. But when we're kind of thinking about diagnosing it, it's a selection of symptoms that have lasted for a period of time. So not just like in that moment, not feeling depressed 1 minute and then not the other kind of thing.
I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you get into therapy? Like, what was your story? Why did you decide, I want to be a therapist? Like, where did that come from?
So I've always been interested in psychology. When I studied A-levels, I was really interested in other people. I'm quite an introverted person. I like to sit back, observe. I'm the eldest of 5 in my family, Caribbean family. Don't talk about mental health. Yeah. So many different issues that were going on within my family, and we didn't speak about it. When I was learning about it a bit more and realising, why do people feel the way that they do when they feel low, and what can we do about it? That's when I started to kind of get into a bit more about, what roles in psychology can you do? Therapy was one of them. Personally, I had really difficult experiences with sexual abuse, with bullying, low self-esteem. Depression was diagnosed at a later date. I didn't get a diagnosis for a while, so there was a lot of kind of physical issues. And for me, what was most important was the education. Like, when I got to the GP, I had a really awful experience. They didn't diagnose it very well. They weren't very sensitive. It wasn't until I did my own research and was learning about it that actually I didn't need medication, which is what they prescribed. I didn't necessarily need therapy at that moment. I just needed, this is depression. I was at uni at the time. Maybe you need to leave your uni room a bit more. You need to work a bit less, have a bit more, pleasurable activities, all of those different things. It was all those things that I needed, but then it got to a point where it was too late. So I needed therapy, I needed medication. It took a lot longer to get to where I needed. And so that's why I got into what I'm doing now, because I want to be able to educate people on what these things are, because they're not spoken about enough.
Interesting. I think it's super interesting, and I'm really conscious that we're all women here, right? And there's loads of statistics now around men's suicide rate and the effects of men and mental health. So I think, and this is me just being nosy, I guess, but I know you're a therapist. How many of your clientele do you see as black men coming through your doors to speak about their mental health?
Very minimal. So I work across different places in the NHS and outside of that, and it's not that there aren't, I haven't had black male clients, because there are there, but just not a lot in comparison. I don't even know percentage-wise, but I would say for me personally, probably less than 5%. And I worked in quite a diverse and deprived borough of London for a period of time, and even still, it was probably overrepresented in that borough, but still not in my career so far, for various reasons.
Okay. Why, I know you said various reasons, but why are some of those reasons?
I think black men have so much, obviously I can't speak as a black man for them, but I guess from what I'm hearing, they have so much responsibility that they need to hold, or feel like they need to hold. And as far as I'm concerned, or they're concerned, it's not manly to speak about your feelings. Even being in a relationship with men, it's like, why are you asking me about my feelings? I don't feel sad, I don't feel this. I'm like,
Don't come to me and talk about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're human, of course you feel sad, but they see it as a weakness to be able to open up. So of course, if you can't even open up to your own partner, your parents, the people close around you, your friends, blah, 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 why are you going to come and speak to a stranger about how you're feeling? So it's not that they're not there, they are. Like in their communities, they're suffering, and they're suffering in silence.
To be honest, that was my issue with therapy. It wasn't necessarily that my mum and dad said that I shouldn't have therapy. It was more, why am I talking to a randomer about my deepest and darkest secrets and all my traumas? What do you know? Like, you don't know me.
But this comes back to the culture of, we was told anything that happens in your household stays in your household. But that has a more damaging impact because you don't know what you don't know, right? So my next question is, before you get to that point, right, where you're at the burnout stage, you're at the point where you can't really function anymore. You said there's loads of resources that are available for people. What type of resources are out there, and how can you stop yourself getting to the worst point?
Yeah, I think awareness and education is a really important one, because you don't know, like sometimes we're not aware of how we're feeling until it gets to a certain point. So one thing I always ask people to do is check in with yourself often, even if that's just writing down every so often, you know, how am I feeling? Then you start to notice a pattern. Actually, I've been feeling low for quite a bit. I've been feeling anxious quite a bit. This is coming up quite a bit. We check in on our friends. We check our money sometimes. We check this, we check that. We don't actually check in on how we're feeling and notice that pattern. So that's where we start first of all, because obviously other people can tell you, you know, but you've been acting a bit different, etc. But until you recognize it for yourself, it's not gonna, you're not gonna notice. So everyone needs therapy, but not everybody can access therapy straight away, or it might not be relevant to them at that particular time. So there are kind of websites, there's the Mind website, there's also Black Minds Matter website as well, where you can be connected to therapists. But the Mind website has loads of different like resources for what can I do when I'm feeling low, what can I do when I'm feeling anxious, those kind of things. I think when we're thinking about mental health, we have to remember that like we exist in our bodies, right? So think about the basics. Are you looking after your body? Are you eating right? Are we sleeping right? Are we, you know, having a good work-life balance? All of those kind of things that when we reach burnout, we're often not doing anyway. And that's not to say that those things prevent us from heading to a mental health decline at all. It's just if we're having those things as a foundation, it helps, especially when you get to therapy. It's like, this is what I want to focus on. So again, with therapy, it's accessing therapy. There is a company, it's part of the NHS, called Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, so IAPT, that we call IAPT. And every single person in the UK will have a kind of borough that they can access through the NHS. And that's where you can get free therapy. The wait list is long, there's a lot of kind of difficulties with that. We won't get into that, we want to know how strange that NHS is, but it's available, it's there. So yeah, there's different things that we can kind of do, but ultimately it starts with us checking in with ourselves as well.
Do you know what, it's funny because it's almost like everyone gets an MOT on their car, right? And you put a lot of emphasis into your physical health, but we're not doing the same with our mental health. So it's putting our mental health on that same pillar, right? Rebecca, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Rebecca, where can our followers and listeners find you?
So they can find me at my website, RebeccaKimberly.com, or on Instagram, Rebecca_Kimberly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. You can find us on socials, on everything, on The Hustle Table, and watch out for our next episode.